The smell of expensive lilies is making me gag. Because the woman standing at the back of the church is wearing my bride's exact dress. Same lace, same silk buttons, same ivory veil. My heart is hitting my ribs so hard I can barely breathe as I watch her reach into her bouquet and pull out a black flash drive. In exactly 4 minutes, Clara will reach this altar, and the heavy oak doors behind her will lock from the outside. I can see Maya's eyes, my former student, and she isn't crying. She's smiling. I need to get that drive before it hits the projection system, or my career, this marriage, and my life are over. But as Clara nears the front, she isn't looking at me with love. She's looking at the woman in her dress, and she's nodding. Why is my bride nodding at the woman who is here to destroy us? Let me take you back to where this began. The scent of gardenias and expensive cologne hung heavy in the stifling air of the cathedral. Julian Sterling adjusted his silk cufflinks, his palms damp against the starch of his shirt. He forced a smile for the rows of senators and tech magnates, their faces a blur of polished teeth and practiced grace. The organist pressed a heavy chord, signaling the start of the procession. Julian turned toward the aisle, his gaze sweeping the front pew. The breath hitched in his throat. There, seated between his mother and the governor, sat Maya Vance. She didn't belong in the family section. Yet she occupied the mahogany bench with the stillness of a marble statue. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, illuminating the intricate lace of her bodice. A precise replica of the Vera Wang gown Julian had purchased for his bride. The same ivory scalloping traced Maya's collarbone. The identical silk-covered buttons marched down her sleeves. Maya tilted her head, her lips curving into a razor-thin smile. She smoothed the tulle of her skirt, the fabric rustling like dry leaves against the stone floor. Julian felt a cold prickle of sweat break across his forehead, stinging his eyes. He counted the buttons on Maya's sleeve, 1, 2, 3, matching the number he knew was on Clara's gown, waiting in the vestibule. This wasn't just a protest. It was a mirror held up to his life, a reflection of the theft he had committed 5 years ago. He looked at the university president, who sat just 2 seats away, her heavy academic medallion glinting in the light. If she noticed the woman in the wedding dress, she gave no sign, her face a mask of institutional marble. Julian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of impending ruin that only he could hear. He needed to act. He needed to purge this ghost before Clara stepped into the light of the sanctuary. Julian caught the eye of Michael Davis, his best man, who stood just a few feet away. Michael was already mirroring Julian's rigid posture, his face a pale reflection of Julian's own anxiety. Julian leaned in, his voice a low, urgent hiss that barely carried over the swelling organ music. "Michael," he whispered, the name catching in his dry throat. "The woman in the front row, the one in the white, she shouldn't be here. You need to get her out. Now. Quietly." Julian felt a momentary surge of confidence. Michael was his fixer, the man who had spent 20 years smoothing over Julian's rougher edges. This was a logical move, a surgical strike to remove the cancer before it metastasized into a public scandal. Michael nodded, his thumb clicking against his index finger in a nervous habit, and began to edge toward the side of the pews. Subverted, Julian watched Michael's progress with a sense of profound relief. He had trained Michael for this. They had handled disgruntled students and jealous colleagues dozens of times over the years. Michael was discreet, a shadow moving through the high society crowd. As Michael reached the end of the front pew and leaned down to whisper in Maya's ear, Julian felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate. He adjusted his collar, feeling for the small 14 etched into the tag. the 14th shirt in his rotation, the number of stability. Maya looked up at Michael, her expression unreadable. And for a heartbeat, it seemed she would go quietly. She began to stand, gathering the voluminous tulle of her skirt. Julian offered a small, private smile to the university president, a silent signal that everything was under control. The crisis was being managed. The perfection of the day was being restored, stitch by stitch. But as Maya stood, she didn't turn toward the side exit. Instead, she pivoted toward the center aisle, her movement sharp and jagged. An usher, a young man with a face full of self-importance, stepped forward to assist Michael, placing a hand on Maya's elbow to guide her away. The touch was the spark. Maya didn't just pull away, she lunged. Her hand, small and deceptively delicate, coiled into a fist that slammed into the usher's chest. The sound of the impact, a dull, wet thud, echoed through the silent gaps in the organ music. The usher stumbled back, his heels catching on the heavy carpet, and he collided with a massive brass candle stand. The metal shrieked against the stone floor before toppling over with a sound like a localized explosion. The sanctuary, once a tomb of polite silence, erupted into a cacophony of gasps and scraping chairs. The quiet removal Julian had envisioned had transformed into a violent spectacle in the center of the aisle. The governor stood up, his face reddening. The university president leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with sharp, academic scrutiny. Julian's heart plummeted into his stomach. By trying to suppress the threat, he had given it a stage and a spotlight. The very scene he had sacrificed his dignity to avoid was now unfolding with the messy, unpredictable energy of a street brawl. And every influential pair of eyes in Boston was fixed directly on the woman wearing his bride's dress. Julian knew he couldn't stay frozen at the altar. The image of the composed groom was shattering with every second the struggle continued. He vaulted over the low marble rail separating the altar from the nave, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He reached the vestibule just as the usher regained his footing. The young man's face twisted in a mask of wounded pride and sudden rage. The usher's hand was raised, fingers curled to strike back at the woman in the white lace. "Stop!" Julian's voice boomed, a deep, authoritative baritone he usually reserved for lecture halls of 300. He stepped between them, his hands outspread. He caught the usher's wrist mid-air, the bone feeling thin and brittle under Julian's grip. With his other hand, he firmly gripped Maya's shoulder, feeling the cold, synthetic silk of the replica gown. He leaned in close to her, his breath hot against her ear, smelling the faint, metallic scent of the electronic components she always carried. "Don't do this, Maya," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Not here. Not like this." The usher tried to pull away, but Julian held fast, his fingers digging into the man's skin. "Go," Julian commanded the usher, his eyes fixed on the young man's. "Get a cloth for the floor. Tell the guests it was an accident with the stand. Move." The usher, cowed by the intensity in Julian's gaze, retreated into the shadows of the side chapel. Julian turned back to the congregation, his face instantly smoothing into a mask of concerned elegance. He offered a shallow, graceful bow to the university president and the Whitmore family. "Our apologies," he said, his voice steadying. A momentary lapse in balance. "The heat in the vestibule is quite oppressive today. Please, let us return our focus to the joy of the hour." He felt the eyes of the socialites soften, their suspicion replaced by the comfortable lie of a small accident. He had reclaimed the narrative. He was the hero of the moment, the man of peace. He turned back to Maya, intending to lead her away, now that the crowd was placated. He felt the weight of victory in his chest, a brief, heady glow of successful manipulation. He had de-escalated the violence and preserved his image. But as he reached to take her arm, Maya's hand opened. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a bouquet of white lilies, their scent cloying and funereal. She let them fall. They didn't hit the floor with the soft rustle of petals. There was a hard, plastic clack. Among the scattered white blooms lay a small, black object, a flash drive, its metallic tip glinting under the cathedral's chandeliers. Julian's breath hitched. He looked from the drive to Maya's face. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore. She was looking at him with a cold, clinical detachment. "It's already done, Julian," she whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic murmur that sounded like she was counting steps. "I didn't come here to scream. I came to broadcast." She pointed a single, steady finger toward the back of the church, where the high-tech digital projection screens, installed by the Whitmores for a modern wedding experience, hummed with a low, predatory energy. The drive wasn't just a threat. It was a key. Julian realized with a jolt of pure terror that the church's system was wireless, and Maya had spent the last 2 years as his assistant, learning every password, every backdoor, and every vulnerability of the people he served. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the sanctuary groaned open, and the organist shifted into the triumphant chords of the bridal march. Clara Whitmore stepped into the frame, a vision of ivory silk and rigid, terrifying perfection. But as she began her walk down the long stone aisle, she stopped dead. Her gaze locked onto Maya, who stood only 10 feet away, wearing the exact same lace, the same silk-covered buttons, the same scalloped collar. The congregation rose in a unified wave, but the usual murmurs of admiration were replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. Clara's father, Robert Whitmore, stepped forward from the front row. He didn't look at the bride. He looked at Julian. He snapped his gold pocket watch shut. Click, snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hollow space. "Julian," Robert said, his voice a low growl of granite and old money. "What is this? Who is this woman?" Julian felt the world begin to tilt. He looked at Clara, whose face was a mask of frozen horror, and then at Maya, who remained as still as a marble saint. "Robert, I can explain," Julian started, his mind racing through 1,000 different lies, trying to find the one that would hold. He reached for his collar, his fingers searching for the number, but his hand was shaking too hard to feel the etching. "She's a former student, a troubled girl. She's had episodes. She must have found out about the dress through the caterers. It's a pathetic attempt at attention." He tried to project the image of the weary, compassionate mentor, but the words felt thin, like paper held up against a hurricane. The ticking sound began then, not from a clock, but from the church's hidden speakers. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Julian's shoes. It was the sound of a heart, or a countdown. Up, her academic medallion clinking up, her academic medallion clinking against her chest. She began to hum, a low, mournful dirge that Julian recognized as Chopin's Marche Funèbre. It was the sound she made when she was preparing to sacrifice someone to save the institution. Julian looked toward the back of the church, desperate for an escape. But the massive oak doors didn't just close, they slammed. The sound of the heavy iron bolts sliding home was final, a mechanical execution of his freedom. They were trapped. "The doors!" A woman in the third row shrieked, her voice cracking the silence. "The doors are locked." Julian lunged toward the side exit leading to the sacristy. his only thought to reach the server room and kill the power. But as he reached the heavy velvet curtain, a man stepped out. He was a massive figure in a dark suit, his neck thicker than Julian's thigh. A security guard Julian didn't recognize. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, his hands clasped in front of him. He began to crack his knuckles. Pop, 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 a rhythmic ritual that sounded like dry branches breaking in a winter storm. "Out of my way," Julian hissed, trying to shove past the man. The guard didn't budge. He felt like a wall of cold meat. Julian looked back at the altar. Maya was standing near the digital podium, her fingers hovering over the screen. Clara was still frozen in the aisle, but she wasn't looking at Maya with hatred anymore. She was looking at Julian with a terrifying, clinical clarity. Julian felt a surge of animal desperation. He turned back to the guard, his eyes spotting a heavy glass case nearby containing an ancient, illuminated Bible and a series of silver academic awards donated by the Whitmores. He didn't think. He reached out and grabbed the heaviest object, a solid silver Excellence in Ethics trophy, shaped like a stylized flame. He swung it with every ounce of his terrified strength. The silver base connected with the guard's temple with a sickening clink. The man's eyes rolled back, and he slumped against the sacristy door, his knuckle cracking silenced at last. Julian didn't stop to check on him. He used the sharp edge of the trophy to wedge into the door frame, heaving with his shoulder until the lock groaned and snapped. He burst into the sacristy, the smell of industrial bleach stinging his eyes. He needed the sexton. He needed the keys. He needed to stop the ticking. "Sexton!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the sterile, white-tiled walls. He saw the small, hunched man in the corner, polishing a brass candlestick as if the world outside wasn't ending. The sexton didn't even look up. He had turned off his hearing aid, his lips moving in a silent prayer of sorry, 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 to the stone apostles carved into the molding. Julian lunged for the man's belt, tearing the heavy ring of keys away with a violent jerk. He turned to run back into the sanctuary, but the door he had just forced open was now being held from the other side. He could see a sliver of the church through the gap. Clara was there. She wasn't crying. She was holding the door shut. "Clara, let me in," Julian pleaded, his face pressed against the wood. "I can fix this. I can explain everything. She's lying, Clara. Everything she says is a lie." Clara's voice came through the wood, cold and steady, devoid of the affection he had spent 3 years manufacturing. "I know she's not lying, Julian," she said. "I've seen the files. I've seen the original thesis from 5 years ago. The one with her name on the header. The one you deleted from the university server." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "How?" he whispered. "Because I'm the one who gave her the password to your cloud storage," Clara replied. "I'm the one who bought her the dress. We've been talking for months, Julian. Every night while you were rehearsing your impromptu speeches in the mirror, I was on the phone with the woman you destroyed. You thought you were marrying a trophy. You were actually marrying an auditor." She let go of the door. Julian stumbled back into the sanctuary, the keys clattering to the marble floor. The digital screens behind the altar were no longer dark. They were glowing with a cold, blue light. The first image appeared, a side-by-side comparison of Julian's prize-winning book and Maya's undergraduate thesis. Paragraph after paragraph was highlighted in red, the similarities so exact they were undeniable. The congregation erupted. Robert Whitmore was screaming now, his face a purple mask of rage. The university president's humming grew louder, a vibrating wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. Julian scrambled toward the pulpit, his eyes fixed on his smartphone. It was sitting right there, next to the microphone. If he could just reach it, he could trigger the remote wipe. He could burn the digital evidence before it scrolled to the financial records, the offshore accounts, the bribes. He lunged for the pulpit, but Maya was there first. She didn't try to hit him. She just blocked his path, her replica gown rustling like a field of dead grass. Julian grabbed her shoulders, trying to hurl her aside. They tumbled against the wooden podium, the struggle a messy, undignified heap of silk and wool. Julian's tuxedo jacket caught on a decorative carving, the fabric shrieking as it tore down the back. His white shirt, number 14, was stained with the dust of the floor. He didn't care. He reached for the phone, his fingers inches from the screen. "Michael!" Julian screamed, looking toward his best man. "Michael, help me! Get her off me!" Subverted. Michael Davis stepped forward. Julian saw the familiar, hesitant gait, the way Michael mirrored Julian's own frantic movements. This was it. Michael would pull Maya away, give Julian the 3 seconds he needed to wipe the server. Michael had been his shadow for 2 decades. He was the only person who knew the full depth of Julian's secrets and had always kept them buried. Julian felt a surge of desperate hope. He could still win. He could claim Maya had hacked his files and altered them. He just needed the evidence gone. Michael reached down, his hand closing around Maya's arm. Julian began to lunge for the phone, his thumb poised to strike the screen. But Michael didn't pull Maya away. He used her as leverage to lean in closer to Julian. He didn't look at Julian with the usual subservient fear. He looked at him with a weary, soul-deep exhaustion. "I'm so sorry, Julian," Michael whispered. The word he had practiced on inanimate objects for years, finally directed at the man who had owned him. Michael's hand didn't move toward Maya. It moved toward his own pocket. He pulled out a small humming device, a signal jammer. Julian's thumb hit the screen of his phone. Nothing happened. The no service icon flickered mockingly at the top of the display. Julian stared at it, his mind refusing to process the failure. What are you doing?" "I gave her the security codes, Julian," Michael said, his voice gaining a terrifying, quiet strength. "I gave her the money for the gown. I've been the lookout for your lies since we were 18, and I'm tired of being the only one who remembers the fire." Michael stepped back, letting Maya go. He didn't look back as he walked toward the university president. He reached into his vest and pulled out a physical folder, thick, heavy, and filled with paper that couldn't be remote wiped. He handed it to the president with a bow that was more graceful than any Julian had ever performed. The betrayal was a physical blow. Julian felt his knees give way, the cold marble biting into his shins. He looked up at the screens. His private emails were scrolling now, the ones where he laughed about the Whitmore inheritance, the ones where he detailed how he would use Clara's father's connections to secure a lifetime appointment. The great man was being dismantled in front of his audience, the stage lights revealing the cheap wood and peeling paint of the facade. Clara walked up the steps of the altar. She didn't look at the screens. She looked down at Julian, her face as cold as the stone apostles. She reached for her left hand and twisted the massive diamond ring. It came off with a soft, sliding sound. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it. The ring hit the dusty floor near Julian's hand, a tiny spark of light in the wreckage. "The wedding is over, Julian," she said. She turned to Maya and took her hand. The 2 women, the bride and the ghost, stood together at the center of the altar, a unified front of ivory lace. Julian scrambled to his feet, his voice cracking as he turned to the congregation. "Wait, everyone, listen," he shouted, his hands outspread in a frantic, rehearsed gesture of academic authority. This is a sociological experiment, an inquiry into the nature of digital ethics and the fragility of reputation. We planned this. The university president and I, we wanted to show you how easily the truth can be manipulated. He looked at the president, pleading for a nod, a sign, anything. Whitmore stepped onto the altar, his heavy feet thudding on the floor. He was wearing a black suit and a black tie, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked around at the crowd, and then he saw her. She was standing at the back of the room, her face hidden by a black veil. She was wearing a black dress, and her hair was pulled back in a bun. She was holding a bouquet of white flowers. He walked over to her, and he took her hand. He kissed her on the cheek, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her, and then he turned to the crowd. "I'm sorry for what I've done." He looked at her. Whitmore stepped onto the altar, his heavy shoes sounding like falling hammers. He looked at Julian not with anger, but with a pure, crystalline pity that was worse than any scream. "You're not a great man, Julian," Robert said. "You're just a man who forgot that the quality of the shirt doesn't matter if the body underneath is rotting." Julian turned and ran. He didn't head for the locked main doors. He dove for the small service door leading to the basement, the keys he had stolen from the sexton still clutched in his hand. He fumbled with the lock, the metal shrieking as he forced it open. He tumbled down the narrow wooden stairs, the air growing hot and humid as he descended into the bowels of the church. The sound of the jeering crowd above faded, replaced by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the ancient boiler. He found the coal chute, a narrow, lightless gullet of rusted tin. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his ruined tuxedo jacket and shoved himself into the pipe. The metal bit into his shoulders, the soot staining his skin and his white shirt black. He crawled through the darkness, his fingernails screeching against the tin, a high-pitched sound that vibrated inside his skull. He was no longer a gentleman. He was a rat in a drainpipe. He emerged into the alleyway behind the church, tumbling onto a pile of rotting trash bags. The freezing Boston rain began to fall, turning the soot on his face into streaks of black tears. He stood up, shivering, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He looked toward the street. The black cars were already pulling away, their taillights like fading embers in the gray light. He saw them then. Clara and Maya were standing under a single umbrella near the church gate. They weren't looking for him. They were looking at each other, their identical dresses glowing in the gloom. Julian realized the truth then, the final, crushing revelation. The gown Maya wore wasn't a replica. It was the original. Clara had given it to her weeks ago, a symbol of their pact, a shared uniform for the execution of a fraud. Julian stood alone in the rain, his hands reaching for his collar. He felt for the number, desperate for the sequence, for the order that would tell him who he was and what came next. But the soot had covered the tag, and the number was lost. He was just a man in a black-stained shirt, a ghost in a city that had already forgotten his name. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a rising sound that promised a different kind of judgment. And Julian Sterling realized that for the first time in his life, he had run out of shirts.